You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791.
And I just couldn't believe it that 250 years later, right? We're at the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. His name is still remembered as founding this Black Baptist congregation that still exists on the Savannah River in South Carolina. So even though he ran away, one of the arguments I make in the book, he flees the United States in the moment of its creation. But I think he's a type of founding father figure, if by founding father we mean the people who built the key institutions of American life. Because the Black Baptist Church is a crucial institution of American life and even of American democracy, I would argue, with the role that it played in the civil rights movement and in voter registration and, fighting for civil rights and the Civil Rights Act.
Hello there, and welcome to Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. I'm your host for today, Joe Edelman. In 1775, about 20% of the people living in British North America were enslaved. They lived throughout the colonies, from New Hampshire and Maine all the way down to Georgia, in a variety of situations, working on plantations and in urban areas. When scholars write about slavery during this time period, they often have to rely on sources outside of the experience of the enslaved people themselves. It's very difficult to find the voices of any ordinary people from early America, and that's doubly true for enslaved people. Both by practice and by law, most enslaved people did not learn to read or write. And so for the colonial and revolutionary era, there are very few sources left in their voice. There are escaped slave narratives, but most of the ones we're familiar with tend to be from later in the 19th century, if you think of people like Frederick Douglass or Solomon Northup. It's rare to find something from the colonial and revolutionary era. But Greg O'Malley has used just such a source to write a dynamic and expansive history of slavery during the Revolutionary era. Greg is a professor of history at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the author of the new book, The Escapes of David George, an Odyssey of Slavery, Freedom, and the American Revolution. In our conversation, Greg reveals why the categories of enslaved and free often obscure the complicated nature of a person's status, how David George experienced slavery and gained his freedom, and then lived in the colonial South, Canada, and West Africa, and what we can learn about slavery based on a narrative written by a formerly enslaved person. I'll be back in just a moment to talk with Greg right after we hear some announcements from Liz.
Thanks, Joe. Greg O'Malley has spent years tracking down the voices of enslaved people whose voices and stories rarely make it into the official records. This kind of scholarship takes a lot of time, dedication, and resources. And Ben Franklin's World, it keeps going because of the people who believe that this type of work matters. Listeners like you and the sponsors who help make it possible. Which is why I want to come to you first. If you run a business, lead a brand, or know someone who does, and you'd like to reach an audience of curious readers, educators, and lifelong learners, I'd love to have a conversation about sponsoring this podcast. Our listeners are thoughtful, engaged, and deeply connected to this community. They show up every week because they trust that the work we do together matters. And that trust extends to the partners I choose, which is why fit matters so much. I want sponsors who can bring real value to our audience and who are excited to reach them. So if this sounds like you or someone you know, please reach out at benfranklinsworld.com/sponsor. That's benfranklinsworld.com/sponsor. And now, I think Joe is ready to introduce you to Greg O'Malley.
Our guest is an award-winning historian of slavery, the slave trade, and early America. He's a professor of history and department chair at the University of California, Santa Cruz. In his first book, Final Passages, The Intercolonial Slave Trade of British America 1619 to 1807, he detailed the brutal network for distributing enslaved Africans throughout North America and the Caribbean after they survived the Atlantic crossing. Based on that research, Greg has worked with other scholars on the Intra-American Slave Trade Database, which has now been integrated into the venerable Slave Voyages database. And he's the author of a new book entitled The Escapes of David George, an Odyssey of Slavery, Freedom, and the American Revolution. Greg O'Malley, welcome to Ben Franklin's World.
Thank you. It's great to be back. It's been a long time since episode 8.
Well, good scholarship takes time, and we are glad that we're still around to talk to you about this book. Let's start with the main subject of the book, this man named David George. Obviously, the whole interview will be about him, but can you start with a thumbnail sketch of who he was and what brought you to him as a historical subject?
Sure. He is a man who was born enslaved in colonial Virginia in the 1740s and really just had this remarkable odyssey of a life through a series of unending attempts to escape enslavement and discrimination, even after he eventually did gain emancipation from slavery. And what brought me to him as a historical subject in many ways was an outgrowth of that first book that I wrote that you mentioned, which is that project was really broad in terms of geography and time. You know, it spanned 200 years, the Caribbean, North America, and was difficult to write and frustrating by the end to me in that the people at the center of the story, the enslaved people on these ships in the slave trade, remain sort of frustratingly and heartbreakingly elusive and unknowable to me. Usually I would just know the number of people aboard a ship, not anything about their background, even just like their age and gender, let alone their names, what they cared about, their families, their beliefs. So I found myself in the late stages of working on that project, fantasizing about a more narrative project that was centered on an individual or a group of individuals as the next project I would like to do. And I stumbled upon David George's story when reading a work by another historian, a great book called Pax Americana by Elizabeth Fenn, that tells the story of this smallpox epidemic that sweeps through North America during the Revolutionary War. And among his many adventures and misadventures and ordeals, David George was a victim of that smallpox epidemic during the war years. And Fenn, in her terrific book, just tells that one episode from his life. And that got me very intrigued. I tracked down the primary source that she referenced, this short narrative of David George's life that survives, and very quickly got taken with it and thought this was the story that I'd been looking for that could be a next book project. And 10 years later, here we are.
Yes, here we are. I want to pick up on that source that you mentioned, that narrative that David George gave in the 1790s. As you describe in the book, in The Escapes of David George, you've structured much of your history of him around that narrative. And it's important to note that it's an unusual source for the time period. Most of the written life narratives that survive for formerly enslaved persons come from later on into the 19th century. So, Greg, when and under what circumstances did he write down his life story? And how did his story come to be preserved?
It's a great question, and it's an unusual set of circumstances that leads to his story being preserved. After the Revolutionary War, David George is part of this wave of refugees. Spoiler alert, the British lose. And when their military evacuates from the new United States, there are a whole bunch of refugees who travel with them. White loyalist refugees, but also formerly enslaved people who'd taken refuge with the British forces during the war. And David George is among that group. And so he moves first to Nova Scotia and then is recruited for a colony that the British are creating in Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa. And there's a couple thousand formerly enslaved people who make this journey from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone as part of the creation of that colony there. But the recruiter from Britain, who is traveling across the Atlantic with those people, chooses David George alone among the 2,000 to then travel with him to London. And he's quite taken with David George. He finds him a fascinating figure, in part because he's become, by that point in his life, a Baptist minister. And he has a congregation among these formerly enslaved people that he's the leader of. So the recruiter brings David George as kind of an ambassador for the colony. I think he's hoping to help garner support among British leaders for this project in Sierra Leone by hoping they'll be as impressed by David George as he is. And so while he's in London on this trip, he never lives there full time, but he makes this visit to London. David George is introduced to a couple of leading Baptist ministers, and they write down an oral account of his life that David George gives to them, and they transcribe it and publish it. So it's presented as the first person. It's a little hard to know how mediated it is by these white ministers who record it, but it's at least presented as his first person words. And they publish it in a fairly obscure publication called the Baptist Annual Register, which is a serial publication that circulated, I think, mostly among other Baptist ministers around the Atlantic world as a way to keep tabs of what was going on in their faith.
I want to focus in for just a second because you said that the source is mediated, which means that you have to do some work to figure out what's David George's voice and then what happens as it gets transcribed by these white ministers and then printed and then read by people. Can you talk for a minute, Greg, just about how you work through the challenge of using that type of source and how you try to get at an authentic voice for David George?
Yeah, I think there were two things that I wanted to be particularly cautious of, especially at the start of the project. One was that David George popped up in so many different interesting places and times, according to this narrative. And some question of, can this really be a true story? It's sort of remarkable. He's taken captive by the Muskogee Creek Nation and lives in an indigenous community for a while. He works in the fur trade. He becomes a Baptist preacher. He lives in Virginia and North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. He's all over the place, has these adventures during the war years. So some of it was just doing some contextual research to make sure that I thought this was plausible, that the names, the places that he mentions, that they all check out as real people who existed contextually. The places and times that he described fit with the reality as historians think we understand it of those places and times. And very quickly, I became convinced that it was a reliable account. And then the other thing that I really wanted to think about was whether the transcribers of his story, the editors of this publication, the Baptist Annual Register, whether it seemed like they had a particular political project in mind that they were using this narrative for. And other than advancing the Baptist faith, I didn't really feel like they did. My impression of the account and the way it's presented in the Baptist Annual Register is that these leading Baptist ministers who organized this publication were really just fascinated by David George and his spiritual journey, how he became a Baptist and how he found a calling to preach and became a preacher despite his humble origins as an enslaved man. It seemed like they were sort of taken with the story as he told it and wanted to share it. I didn't get the sense that they did much editorializing. It sort of reads as a religious testimonial in the evangelical tradition.
His life really is fascinating, Greg. And I have to say, I hadn't realized until reading the book how literally you mean your title, The Escapes, plural, of David George. In his first decades of his life, as you mentioned, he's born enslaved. Then he runs away and becomes a fugitive and works for a white man in a Carolina frontier area in this nebulous state between slavery and freedom. Then he's captured by the Muskogee Creek and enslaved again by a Creek trader. Then he chose to stay enslaved, but at a different plantation before he eventually becomes free for good. Obviously, we hope people will read The Escapes of David George to get the full story, but can we start focusing on his early years? What are the key elements for us to understand about the early part of his life? And why did he take such a circuitous path from slavery to freedom?
Yeah, I love that question because to me, this is the part of the story that is the most fascinating. Other historians have written about David George. I make no claim to being the first historian to have discovered this account or him as a historical figure. But most people who've written about him have written about one or another episode in his life in the context of telling some larger story. And mostly that's been for the later phases of his life when he is a religious leader among this community of refugees in Nova Scotia, when he's leading the Baptist congregation in that colony I talked about in Sierra Leone. And the reason I decided to write a book about David George is that I didn't feel like historians have done enough with the phase of his life that you're asking me about right now. This series of escape attempts that on one level are unsuccessful because he can't find emancipation before the Revolutionary War sort of destabilizes the system enough that he finds a way out. But I hesitate to call them failed escape attempts either, because he never ends up back on the plantation where he started in Virginia. And if you pay close attention to how he describes his circumstances in these different places that he ends up, I think we see him improving his life by his own measure. And so what's really fascinating to me about this phase of his life, this series of escape attempts, his life on the run, where he's not legally emancipated, but his slaveholder can't find him, I think we see two things really powerfully. And one is that there's nowhere to go. This is before there are free states in the North. The free states in the North are part of the aftermath of the American Revolution. When these are all British colonies, slavery is legal everywhere. It's legal in New York. It's legal in Massachusetts. It's legal in Pennsylvania. And so one of the things that was striking to me about David George's story right out of the gate is that when he runs from this plantation, he leaves after midnight, he says, runs through the night to get as far away as he can before anyone realizes he's gone. He runs south. Right. And it flies in the face of everything we as Americans, all the stories we tell about slavery are escape to the North, escape to the North. North is the zone of freedom. That's not his world. In the 1740s when he's born, or in the 1760s when he runs away for the first time at 19 years old.
Why is south the direction that he runs?
He doesn't say, and that's one of the things that's fascinating, is I'm constantly wrestling in this book with the fact that he tells us what he did, but he doesn't often say why. And so I'm often left as a historian of trying to infer the logics of his decisions when all I know is the decision itself, not the reasons behind it. And based on the historical context around him, I think there's two things that I would highlight to try to answer that question. One is that prior to the North being a zone of freedom, it actually would be a bad strategic move for a runaway from slavery to head in that direction, because there wouldn't be much of a Black community there to blend into or to look to for aid. The Black population in those northern towns was pretty small for the most part, and I don't think there'd be an easy way for him to get there in any case. I think the reason he runs south down into North Carolina is that he's basically trying to head to the margins of the colonial world. What he seems to use as a strategy in those years is he works for a series of different white landowners, one of them who he lives with for 2 years, he says, who basically offer him shelter and a place to live in exchange for labor. And so I think he's staying to sort of these frontier zones where there are less affluent white individuals trying to carve farms out of the woods at the margins of the colonial world, who are very eager for labor to help with that project, and where there's not a lot of law and order to put him at risk of recapture. And so he finds people who are willing to harbor him in exchange for work. And so he's sort of living in kind of this liminal space between slavery and freedom. He's not legally emancipated, but is exerting some control over the terms of his work and where he lives.
He's also, if I'm remembering correctly, mindful of river systems as he's moving around. That's a primary focus for him in terms of pathways.
Yeah, as he describes that journey, he seems to be mindful of like borders and rivers. I think these are geographic obstacles that were an important part of the logistics of his escape. So as he narrates that part of his life, which he does quite briefly, but he says, I went down, I crossed this river, then I crossed that river. He uses that kind of terminology a lot. And so I think those were moments of danger. And I also have some theory that the man who I think was his original owner, slaveholder, a man named James Chappell, in his narrative, David George only gives the last name Chappell for this individual, but based on contextual clues about where he says he lived, And I used land records and other things to try to piece together who would have been this individual. I think it's a man named James Chappell. And if I'm right about that, Chappell was the sheriff of the county in which David George was born. And so I think some of his attention to crossing borders and rivers and stuff was about getting out of Chappell's jurisdiction as well. I think he was very cognizant of the long reach of this individual and wanted to make sure to put some barriers and borders between himself and this slaveholder who he feared would recapture him.
Greg, because The Escapes of David George is based on a religious narrative, we know that David George was a Christian, a Baptist. But he had to experience conversion to Christianity. He wasn't born a Christian. And that happened while he was enslaved at the Silver Bluff plantation in South Carolina a little later in his story. One thing you note in the book is that neither of his parents converted. And for enslaved people, this seems emblematic of what I think you're describing as a generational difference based on how many generations away from Africa enslaved people were. His parents were born in Africa. He's born in North America. So, Greg, can you tell us a little about how he came to Christianity and how his spiritual practice differed from his parents? And then more generally, how does that speak to how enslaved Africans and African Americans practiced spirituality?
It's a very central part of the narrative. And one of the things that also interests me about the document is that unlike a lot of the other accounts we have, first-person accounts from enslaved people, which take the form of sort of abolitionist pleas, that figures like Olaudah Equiano, Harriet Jacobs, Frederick Douglass, they all appeal directly to readers to ask them to take up anti-slavery activism, right? They're pretty explicit about their abolitionist purpose in telling their story. They're exposing the horrors of slavery. And don't get me wrong, slavery comes off looking very bad in David George's account, but he doesn't seem to be telling his story explicitly for the purposes of discrediting slavery. He's really talking to two Baptist ministers about how he became a Baptist. He's telling the story of his spiritual journey. It seems to be the primary through line of his narrative. And he gives more detail to the conversion experience in his life than he does to most other parts of his story. In that, he's explicit, as you noted, in saying that his parents were not Christian and that he was not particularly interested in Christianity in the first few decades of his life. He says he was introduced to it. His master in Virginia would sometimes take him to church, but that he didn't really take any interest in it. And that's pretty typical. Most slaveholders were concerned about economic productivity and security and didn't put a lot of energy into trying to convert enslaved people to Christianity. So David George says he takes a greater interest in Christianity when he's living on this plantation in South Carolina. And it's not the slaveholder who introduces him to the religion at this time. It's itinerant preachers, people who don't have a position of authority over him. He describes a series of individuals visiting the Silver Bluff plantation or the community thereabouts and telling him about Christianity. It's part of this evangelical movement. It's one of the key stories of the spread of evangelical Christianity in the South, is that there were a lot of these itinerant preachers who would travel around from community to community, especially out in these kind of frontier zones where there weren't established churches yet, and visit communities and preach to them. And that story is very central to the emergence of African American Christianity in general, that enslaved people were much more interested in and taken with Christianity when learning about it from these itinerant preachers who weren't in a position of authority over them. And so it's partly that it's not top down, right? It's not their master's religion. It's a religion they're being exposed to in other ways. Also, many of these evangelical preachers leaned into and emphasize some of the more egalitarian messages of Christianity, right? The equality of all souls before God. And so many enslaved people perceive something a little bit subversive, potentially anti-slavery, in those messages from the Christian gospel. And it's part of the reason why Black Baptist churches and Black Methodist churches became such important institutions, is that enslaved people gravitated towards these evangelical preachers who weren't even preaching in churches. They were these humble individuals marching from town to town or riding on horseback from town to town and preaching the religion, some of whom were Black and some of whom were white. So David George comes to the religion that way.
How much of a coincidence is it, Greg, that David George ended up as a Baptist rather than a Methodist or some other denomination? Is it clear whether there are elements of the Baptist faith in particular that appealed to him above and beyond the fact that it was a Baptist preacher who showed up and was there at the moment that David George found Christianity appealing?
That's a great question. And it seems to me that it's certainly important which denomination, insofar as the Baptist strain of Christianity was one of the ones at this time emphasizing these egalitarian messages. David George was baptized as a child in the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And the Church of England had a much more hierarchical structure, more similar to the Catholic Church, with its hierarchy of priests and bishops and archbishops. Priests were typically university trained and appointed to a congregation by the authorities above them, where in these evangelical branches of Christianity, individuals could feel a calling to preach and start preaching. And they often weren't educated in the same way. They weren't appointed by people who were authorities above them. And so that much more sort of ground up kind of church, I think, had a real appeal to enslaved people who were subjugated in the social hierarchy in which they lived. So a church that wasn't built on that same kind of hierarchy held a real appeal. So whether he might have been a Methodist instead of a Baptist is hard to say. I don't think I know enough about his particular doctrine to be able to say that. But I do think it's clear that he says the religion he was introduced by his slaveholder didn't appeal to him in his youth, and he suddenly gravitates to it. But another part of the story of his conversion that I think is really important is also the timing. He describes having this spiritual awakening right around the time of the birth of his first child. So after he's made these series of escape attempts and is then taken captive by the Muskogee Creeks when he runs into the territory of the Creek Nation, he works in a Creek community for a while. Through complicated change of circumstances I won't get into, end up brokering his sale to European fur traders. He works in the fur trade for a period of years and then ends up on a plantation owned by a very prominent fur trader named George Galvin. And it's the first time after several years of running around and experiencing this Odyssey that I've called it, that he lives in the same place for 10 years. And while he's there, he marries, he has children. And then it's around the time of the birth of this first child that he starts taking a real interest in Christianity, describes having an overpowering reaction to one of these visiting preachers coming through. And he has a real crisis. We can understand that crisis purely on the spiritual plane. He starts worrying about the fate of his soul and what's going to happen to him after death. But I think it's also not coincidental that this comes at a moment when he's putting down roots in a place. He's clearly enslaved again. It's clear who his master is. He lives on that master's plantation. He now has a wife and children, right? When he runs away when he's 19 years old, he runs alone. And that's very typical of enslaved people trying to make escape attempts. It's very hard to run with a family or any kind of group of people. And so I feel like his spiritual crisis is partly born of this experience of realizing he might be stuck here. That by putting down roots, having family, having children, he's explored all the possibilities for escape in this world, and he can't find a way out of slavery. And so when he talks about, I think his words are, I realized I could not be saved by any of my own doings. And he's talking about his spiritual conversion then, but I think his words apply equally well to his enslavement. He's realized that he can't find a way out of his enslavement, at least on the terrestrial plane, right? But on a spiritual plane, he can. He's finding an existence through both family and faith that's meaningful to him outside of his enslavement. So I don't mean in any way to be dismissive of it as a genuine religious conversion that he experiences, but I do view it as another kind of escape from slavery. When he narrates those 10 years of his life when he lives at the Silver Bluff plantation, he hardly ever talks about his master. He says very little about the work that he did. Mostly what he talks about is his family. He talks about getting married. He talks about having children. He talks about finding a conversion. He talks about building a congregation, becoming a preacher. He's creating a meaningful life for himself outside of slavery or sort of beyond his enslavement. He remains enslaved, but that's not defining the most meaningful parts of his life to him.
Can we talk a little about his family, Greg? In The Escapes of David George, you make a point to refer to him as Davy in the early parts of the book, which is how he would have been known to the people around him while he was a boy living under slavery. When he became free, for the very first time, he could pick his own surname, his family name, and he picked the name George. Do you know why he picked that particular name?
I don't, but I have theories. This is another example, right? He doesn't tell me why he does things. He only tells us what he does. So he makes his escape during the Revolutionary War by running to the British military and taking advantage of a British policy that offered refuge to people who ran away from what they termed rebel masters. It wasn't a policy motivated by anti-slavery, right? Slavery was legal throughout the British Empire, but it was a way to try to undermine the rebellion. When David George is living behind British lines in British-occupied Savannah, the first document that actually refers to him with the last name David George is a rental agreement. He rents some land that he's going to farm on. It refers to him as David George and refers to him as free. He doesn't explain where the last name came from. But up to that point in his story, there are 3 people by the name of George who loom fairly large in the account. So I've described the slaveholder who he rarely mentions on that plantation where he lived for 10 years called Silver Bluff. The owner of that plantation was a man named George Galphin, very prominent figure in the fur trade of the southern colonies and owner of this large plantation with more than 100 enslaved people living on it. I think the least likely possibility is that David George took the name to honor Galphin in some way. And I say that because he does credit Galphin in his account. He refers to him as very kind to me, are the words he uses. I think we have to take that with a huge grain of salt because he's only referring to him that way in comparison to prior slaveholders who he describes as incredibly viciously abusive to him. But he also does credit Galphin with giving him the permission to preach and form this congregation. And so I think he does sort of have a grudging appreciation for Galphin in that sense. But I still think it's unlikely. Also, it would be more likely to take Galphin's surname to honor him than to take the first name George. But there's no one in his story with the surname George. So a second possibility, which I think is more likely, is that David George took the name to honor a friend named George Lyle, who played a really important role in David George's religious conversion. George Lyle was one of these itinerant preachers who David George describes visiting the Silver Bluff plantation. Lyle had actually been freed by his master because his master was so taken with his preaching ability and his spirituality. So it was sort of an act of devotion on the part of his master. He wanted this formerly enslaved man to be able to go and spread the gospel. And so he emancipated him from slavery. And Lyle visits Silver Bluff and sort of counsels David George when he's in the depth of that spiritual crisis. And then after David George escapes from slavery, when he's living in British-occupied Savannah, he reconnects with George Lyle. That's where George Lyle lived. Silver Bluff Plantation is well inland from there, up the Savannah River. But they reconnect and they actually establish a congregation together in Savannah during the war. So they live on a piece of land together, they farm together, and they preach together, and then end up going their separate ways at the end of the war. But I think it's possible that David George takes the surname to honor George Lyle. But there again, it raises the question of why take his first name rather than the surname. The third George is actually never mentioned by name in David George's account, but sort of looms large behind the whole thing, and that's King George. And I think it's plausible that David George takes the name to honor the king because he gains his emancipation by taking advantage of this British policy. I think there's some possibility, even though it wasn't a royal decree, we as historians know that. I think it's plausible to think that David George might have associated this British policy as having come down from the king. And so maybe credited King George. And since King George, isn't known by a surname so much, it might make sense to take that George as a surname, as an honorific. But all of this is speculation. We don't know.
Greg, I want to find out more about David George's wife and children. But before we do that, we should take a moment to thank our episode sponsor.
What Greg O'Malley has helped us understand is just how rare a source like David George's narrative really is. The story of an enslaved man in colonial America told in his own words, preserved because two Baptist ministers in London happened to be so taken with the man standing before them that they wrote down his story and published it in a Baptist periodical. Now, Greg has spent years working to understand David George's world, the Virginia plantation where he was born, the South Carolina frontier where he ran, the Muskogee Creek community that took him in, and the Revolutionary era South where he forged his faith, his family, and eventually his freedom. This research took Greg into archives on both sides of the Atlantic world. But the American side of the story, the society that David George was born into, enslaved within, and ultimately had to leave behind, lives in archives and institutions just like the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791. Now, the same Atlantic world that Greg O'Malley describes, the merchants, the trading networks, the families wrestling with slavery's contradiction during the Revolutionary era, is documented in collections at the MHS. These records help scholars trace ordinary people, the people that official records often forget. That's what historical institutions like the Massachusetts Historical Society do. They preserve the papers, images, and objects that help make histories like the one Greg is talking about possible. Now, our partnership with the MHS helps us bring you more of this kind of work, and it keeps our episodes freely available. But there's another part of what makes this podcast possible, and that's you. Ben Franklin's World has been going for nearly 12 years, and it has always been a community effort. So if this show has become part of your routine, if you found yourself down a rabbit hole because of a conversation you heard, I'd love for you to consider supporting us at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Every bit of support helps, so thank you. Thank you for listening, for caring about this work, and for helping to keep it going. And a sincere thank you to Jonathan D., Madeline D., Peter D., John E., Richard E., and Megan John E. for your generous support. Thank you for supporting this work.
Greg, you discuss in the book that David George was married to a woman who was enslaved with him at the Silver Bluff plantation in South Carolina, and that they then had several children. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about his family, who they were, and what else we might know about them.
Yeah, we don't know a great deal. And in fact, one thing that really troubled me for a while in the research is that David George refers to his wife with that phrase, my wife, numerous times in the narrative, but he never refers to her by name. And I was very troubled by the idea that I might end up writing this book without even knowing what her name was. Thankfully, as I got into researching the later parts of his life, there are a few historical documents that preserve her name, which is Phyllis. And we don't know a ton about Phyllis George. I think it's quite revealing that either David George didn't mention her name in his account or the transcribers of account didn't bother to include her name. But one way or another, I see patriarchy lurking there, that her name doesn't come through. She was significantly younger than David George. I learned from a census record in Nova Scotia when they lived up there. But beyond that, we don't know a tremendous amount about her. David George makes mention of her having a brother who plays a role in the story. And that brother, he mentions being of mixed African and Creek heritage. So she may have had Native American ancestry, but I think parsing the language in the account that David George is actually differentiating her brother from Phyllis when he describes that parentage. So I think they're technically half siblings and that she may not have shared the Native American ancestry. So it's a little bit unclear exactly what her background is, but she at least has some African ancestry, and I think maybe primarily African ancestry. We also know from some of the ways David George refers to his ministry up in Nova Scotia. After moving up there as a refugee, he establishes a congregation, they build a church. He ends up preaching in various communities. He's invited to preach for quite a vast distance. He becomes a well-known preacher in Nova Scotia. That she's involved in the ministry in some way. He does at one point refer to himself and my wife, using that phrase again, hearing people's testimonials before they become full members of the church. So we know that she was involved in the church in that sense. And I would say we also know she was very resilient. One of the most remarkable stories in his narrative, and it's the one that Elizabeth Fenn narrates when David George has smallpox in her book, the way that I first stumbled upon this story. And it's the one that I used to open the book, actually. He tells the story when he's sick with smallpox. It's one of the just remarkable turns of events in his story. They're living outside Savannah at the time, and American forces are advancing on Savannah to try to retake the city. And David George is lying ill with smallpox, says that he feared that he was going to die, and fearing the re-enslavement of his family, he encourages Phyllis to take their children, at that point 2 or 3 children, and to leave him behind because he's too ill to travel with smallpox. So they do. She runs into the town of Savannah, thinking that will be the safest place to potentially evacuate on British ships if the town falls to the Americans. And they leave David George in a small house, thinking that he's going to die. But miraculously, he neither dies, even though he has no one to take care of him anymore while he's lying sick with smallpox. And he doesn't fall into the hands of the American forces and face re-enslavement, and eventually walks into Savannah and finds his family again. It's one of the more remarkable incidents of the story, but it's a place where I think we see Phyllis emerge a little bit more in this account, to have the bravery and fortitude to take the children and leave her husband behind to make sure the children are not re-enslaved.
And from this point forward, Phyllis is making the same trips, the same escapes that David George is, right? She's going from Savannah to Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone.
That's correct. Yeah, she's involved in all of that. And in the end, they have several more children and remain married up until David George passes away in Sierra Leone in 1810. So he lives quite a long life. He's born in the 1740s. And I don't know how long she lives, but I know they're married up until he's living in Sierra Leone.
Let's travel with David George and his family from the region of South Carolina and Georgia up to Nova Scotia. That, as you mentioned earlier, is something that hundreds of African Americans did at the end of the Revolutionary War, both from the South and from New York. In The Escapes of David George, you then explained that he and his family landed in the town of Shelburne in Nova Scotia, which is 120 miles southwest of Halifax. There, he becomes a preacher in a nearby town called Birchtown, which seems to have been set up for these Black refugees. And then he also serves as an itinerant pastor going around church to church in the region. So, Greg, can you tell us about how he built his congregation? Was he preaching both to Black and to white audiences? And what sort of support and opposition did he face as they were working to get themselves established in Nova Scotia?
This is a great question. I said earlier that what really drew me to this story was his story of resisting slavery and this series of escape attempts early in his life. But I ended up getting really taken with this story of the refugee community in Nova Scotia because it's just an astonishing story. He's among 10,000 refugees, Black and white, that the British drop off in this harbor, as you know, south of Halifax in Nova Scotia. The bay there is called Port Roseway, and they build this town called Shelburne. But what's remarkable about the story, and I think is often underappreciated, is that there was no town of Shelburne before they dropped off 10,000 refugees on this bay. They drop people on a forested bay, 10,000 people, give them nails and tools and leave them with provisions and say, build a settlement. It's really just one of the unbelievable stories of the Loyalist refugees after the American Revolutionary War. All the more striking because the population of Shelburne today is only like 2,500 people. It's the most populous this region has ever been, is in this moment when all these refugees are dropped off there.
I looked it up on Google Maps. It is a very, very small place today.
Yeah, it's really not very big. It's also very well preserved. It's a fascinating place to visit. There's a lot of the original architecture survives. But it's hard to imagine when you're sitting in there in this quite small town, there having been a city of, 10,000 people there for these brief years after the war. And the population then dwindles fairly quickly as people find agriculture tough there. Turns out the bay freezes over in the winter. So it's not a great port or even fishing harbor, even though the waters are pretty rich with marine life around there. But because the harbor freezes in cold winters, it's a bit problematic. So the population dwindles. But anyway, David George starts preaching in this community when it's literally a tent community and they're just building the first structures. He actually says that he would sing in the evenings. It's one of the rare glimpses that I get of his preaching style. I find it really interesting that he describes it as singing, that he would sing the gospel and drew people to him. And he builds a congregation there that is mostly among the Black community. And there are several thousand refugees from slavery who live there, but they are outnumbered by white refugees in the community. And smaller numbers of white settlers in the area also start attending his preaching. And it leads to a lot of controversy. It seems that it's some who, for one reason or another, white settlers who had been introduced to the Baptist faith by other means and were excited to have a Baptist preacher in the area. And so there's some from up the coast who come to Shelburne seeking David George out because they've heard there's this Baptist preacher there, and they bring him back to their community to preach to the community and eventually come down to Shelburne to have him baptize them into the church. David George describes this as a wonderful thing, that there are Black people and white people coming together in his church. But many white members of the Shelburne community don't feel that way. And so he describes a lot of controversy. In one case, there's a white woman who he's trying to baptize and says that this woman's sister is literally pulling her hair, trying to hold her from being baptized by David George, trying to physically pull her away from him during the baptism. And ultimately, this culminates in a race riot in Shelburne. And it has some of its own causes that are not directly tied to David George's story. It's partly about frustrations in this refugee community with how hard life is, trying to carve this meager existence out of the wilderness in Shelburne, this forested bay where the soil's rocky. But as tragically often happens, people scapegoat one another in these difficult conditions. And so many in the white community blame the Black refugees in their midst for driving down wages. That the fact that there are Black people willing to work for less, keeps wages low, is the way they interpret this crisis, where the economy is just failing to get off the ground in this new community they're building in Shelburne. And so rioters target the Black community. But the white rioters also seem to target David George specifically and his congregation. So they pull down the homes of several Black families who are living on the land where David George is preaching and where the Black community has built this meeting house. And they chase David George out of the settlement. He describes hiding in the woods for a period of time, and then he takes up residence in this sort of satellite town of Shelburne that's called Birchtown. If you go there now, it's a neighborhood within the town of Shelburne. They had separate town names at this time, and they were segregated. It was where most of the Black community lived. But David George actually lived in Shelburne, the majority white town. And so he then went and took up residence in Birchtown, and a white tavern owner set up in the church building that the Black community had built for this Baptist church for a period of a time.
It's not a direct result of the race riot, but it's also not unrelated that shortly thereafter, many of the Black residents in Birchtown, Shelburne, and elsewhere in Nova Scotia leave Canada and head east across the Atlantic Ocean to the British colony of Sierra Leone in West Africa, which is, I think, the final of the escapes of David George that the book title invokes. Why, Greg, were the British encouraging Black colonists from Nova Scotia and elsewhere to make this trip east across the Atlantic to West Africa? And it's important to mention that this is a continent which, because many of the refugees were born in North America, that they haven't ever seen. They've never been to Africa at all.
Yeah, it's a really important question. I mentioned earlier that one of the themes I explore in the book is this blurry line between slavery and freedom, right? We often imagine it as this really stark divide between these two things. But I question whether David George has found a certain kind of freedom while he's on the run from slavery, but not yet legally emancipated. And I also raised some questions in this part of the book when he and the other refugees from slavery in Nova Scotia are clearly emancipated, but they face tons of discrimination in Nova Scotia of whether they've achieved true freedom or how much the shadow of their former enslavement continues to linger over them and restrain their possibilities. And so the riot in Shelburne is the most dramatic moment of that discrimination, but it's far from an isolated incident. The British promised to the refugees from the Revolutionary War when relocating to these British territories like Nova Scotia, they promised all of them land. It's explicit in the policy that is offered regardless of race, right? Black people and white people are all eligible for a certain number of acres in Nova Scotia when they voluntarily relocate there with the British. And it takes a while. Everyone's frustrated by how long it takes for everyone to get their plots of land. And this is an understandable problem, right? You drop 10,000 refugees on this bay, and it's going to take a while to survey out plots and figure out who gets which plot of land. And there are surveyors assigned to do that work, to sort of carve up this wilderness into private property. But sadly and predictably, white people get their land first. And when eventually some of the lots are doled out to members of the Black community there, they're smaller than promised. Some communities never get their allocations of land. And eventually, after several years of these mounting frustrations, the Black community organizes and starts petitioning the government in Britain about the discrimination they're facing in Nova Scotia and that they're not getting the promised land, that they're struggling to feed themselves and make an existence in Nova Scotia because of that discrimination. Meanwhile, there's a group of anti-slavery activists in England that is worried about the fate of other refugees from slavery after the American Revolutionary War who are living in London, right? Nova Scotia is not the only place refugees go after the war. And the Black community in London is also facing similar discrimination, struggling to find employment and battling poverty. And some of these anti-slavery activists, Black and white, in London, hit upon the idea to create a colony in West Africa that will be a sort of experimental anti-slavery colony in the slaveholding empire that is Great Britain. So slavery remains legal throughout other British colonies, but they are going to create, and they get permission from the British government to create a colony in Sierra Leone that will be a place where slavery is outlawed. They make a first attempt at this that doesn't go very well. Various disasters befall the settlers coming directly from England who go to Sierra Leone to found this colony. When they're trying to regroup and organize a second attempt at settlement there, these abolitionists in London hear about the petitions of these frustrated Black refugees in Nova Scotia and think maybe they'll be interested in moving to Sierra Leone. So the Sierra Leone company in London that's organizing this colonial venture and is made up of abolitionists in London, they send a recruiter, one of their number, a guy named John Clarkson, and he travels to Nova Scotia to recruit among the Black community there. There's about 4,000 Black refugees in Nova Scotia at the time, and about 2,000 of them sign up for the Sierra Leone colony. The Sierra Leone company is sort of overwhelmed by the number. They were not expecting this many people to sign up. And the biggest number of them come from Shelburne and Birchtown, this community that David George is part of. And one of the really striking features of the research was finding in the British National Archives, I found the original sign-up sheet from Shelburne of people signing up for this colony in Sierra Leone. And David George is the first name on the list. And then the other 2,000 people sign up below him. So it's, I think, a testament to his leadership in that community that he's the first among them.
So David George and his family moved to Sierra Leone. And once he's there, missionaries recruit him to make what's essentially a publicity trip to London. He goes there and tells his story to these groups of Baptist ministers. That then gets published in the Baptist Annual Register in 1794. So up to that point, Greg, you have his description of events to start from as you developed your research for the escapes of David George. But after 1794, there's no more narrative, so we don't have a source that traces his life from then until his death. Greg, how did you piece together his story then during the last 20 or so years of his life?
That was one of the real challenges of it. In a way, his narrative is really the spine of the story. And then everything else I did was kind of to flesh out the story for the first many chapters of the book. And then for this last phase of his life, all of a sudden that spine wasn't there. And so readers who pick up the book will notice that that last section of his story, I organized a little bit differently, because instead of having David George's narrative as a kind of through line to follow, instead what I get are these sort of snapshots, these bits and pieces of his story without the connective tissue in between. So the way I decided to write that section was to just narrate a few episodes of his life that emerge from the sources that survive, that I think are suggestive of his stature in the community in that period, his emerging confidence in his freedom, I would say, for lack of better terms. So what I have are a few different kinds of sources that refer to him. Because he's a community leader by that late stage in his life, he does show up in other kinds of records with some regularity. So the official papers in the British National Archive left by government officials, white government officials that Britain sends down to govern the colony, they mention David George fairly often. He is seen as something of a go-between figure between the community of these Black refugees there and the British authorities. When relations are tense, these British leaders sometimes appeal to David George to try to help them pacify the community, appease the community, tamp down tensions. They look to him as one of the more trustworthy members of the community. They rely on him a lot when situations are tense. So that's one way he shows up in the records, is in those accounts. Baptist missionaries in England also send missionaries down to preach there, white missionaries from England. And because David George has a Baptist church up and running, it's often written into their instructions that they should go seek out David George to get started. So he shows up in the network of these missionaries. There are a couple letters from David George that survive that he writes to folks in England, but more so he gets mentioned in the accounts of these other missionaries who go there, some of whom speak very favorably of him and some of whom are sort of dismissed by him. And one of the things I find really interesting about that is it shows his growing confidence, right? This is his church. And so people who come in and are not respectful or expect him to bow and scrape before them because they're white men, he isn't supportive of. He doesn't help them get up and running in the colony's missionaries. But others who approach him as a brother receive a very warm welcome and speak in glowing terms of his hospitality and support for them and their work there. So these glimpses you get of him from those kind of accounts are very interesting. And then I think my favorite source for that part of his story is one of the governors appointed by Britain for the colony, this man named Zachary Macaulay, keeps a very detailed journal through a lot of his time living in and governing the colony. And he's he's very sanctimonious in the way he talks about everyone, white and Black, in the colony. But he describes some encounters with David George in ways that are really striking, including one where he takes a long walk with David George because he's a little bit disappointed in the way David George is running his congregation, and describes this religious debate that the two of them have. And he says it goes on for hours. And I think even though he's somewhat dismissive of George, I think reading between the lines of that conversation, we get some real glimpses of David George's personality. And the fact that he's willing to debate and argue with the white British appointed governor of this colony really says something powerful about how far he's come in his life. This man who was born enslaved in colonial Virginia is now debating finer points of Christian doctrine with the governor of a British colony for hours on end. As Governor Macaulay would tell it, Macaulay is winning the debate. I think we see between the lines that David George is not at all convinced that Macaulay has won this debate. He sticks up for himself quite effectively, and Macaulay is vexed by that. And I love that as a sort of coda to the story.
I definitely agree how fascinating it is to watch a man come into himself like that. Greg, I have one more question about your process, because you've mentioned through our conversation that in researching the escapes of David George, you visited most of the places where David George lived. That includes Aiken, South Carolina, which is where the Silver Bluff plantation is, and the site where David George became a preacher while still enslaved. I would just love for you to tell the story of what happened when you visited that site.
Yeah, it was the most remarkable experience of doing this research, I think. I was in South Carolina doing research in the state archives there, looking for other pieces of the story. And one striking feature of David George's story that we haven't talked about yet is that, well, when he's 19 years old and runs away, he runs away alone. When the Revolutionary War breaks out, he's more than 30 years old. He's now a father and a husband and a preacher and a leader of a congregation. And so when he runs away that time, he runs away with dozens of other people. They make this mass escape to the British. David George says more than 50 people. The British general who describes this group of enslaved people arriving in the British camp says 90. David George's former master, who is escaping, George Galpin, says 130. So it depends who you believe how many there are, but by everyone's account, it's a big group. One of the biggest mass escapes from slavery, I think, in its history. But the way David George narrates that part of the account, he says that he, his family, and his congregation run away. So it never occurred to me to look for remnants of the congregation. I sort of took David George at his word for it. And while I was in South Carolina to do work in the archives, trying to find things like where did the landowner live, on whose land David George, hid out for a period of time, things like that, I decided to go visit the site of the Silver Bluff plantation where I knew he had lived for 10 years. And I can't remember how I learned, but I knew that it had become a Audubon sanctuary. It's a bird sanctuary owned by the Audubon Society now. At some point, the land had been donated. And so I was just planning on a Sunday, on a day when the archives were closed, to go walk around there and see what I could see, just to get a feel for the place and the landscape. And literally putting into my Google search bar for the directions, Silver Bluff, and I was going to then type Audubon Sanctuary. As I'm typing Silver Bluff, my search bar autofills with Silver Bluff Baptist Church. And you know the way the search bar suggests what you're typing. And so I stopped for a second and I'm like, Silver Bluff's not the name of a town. It's the name of this Audubon sanctuary, and it was the name of this big plantation. Like, what are the chances? So I let the autofill happen and Google Silver Bluff Baptist Church. And sure enough, there's this Black Baptist church in Aiken, South Carolina, right near the site of the plantation. And I couldn't think of any reason why it would be named that other than having some connection to this plantation. And so I called the church, I emailed the church, I couldn't get through to anybody. So I just decided on a Sunday during this research trip that I would go to church and see who was there and who I could meet. And so I showed up early because I didn't want to be intrusive and wasn't sure what my welcome would be, and park on the lawn in front, which is, where folks park at the church. And there was a gentleman sitting in his car outside. This is like an hour maybe before the church service is supposed to start. And thankfully, there was one person there outside. And he sees me drive in, steps out of his car, and I step out of mine, say good morning to each other. And he says, "What brings you to our church today?" And I start to explain and say, well, it's kind of a strange story. I'm a historian from California, and I'm researching the life of a man named David George. And I'm about to continue. There's a clear ... But he stops walking and just gives me this look, this incredulous look. And so I stop talking and I say to him, "You know that name, don't you?" And he just smiled and said, "Well, I guess you better come inside." And I just couldn't believe it that 250 years later, right? We're at the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. His name is still remembered as founding this Black Baptist congregation that still exists on the Savannah River in South Carolina. So even though he ran away, one of the arguments I make in the book. He flees the United States in the moment of its creation. But I think he's the type of founding father figure, if by founding father we mean the people who built the key institutions of American life. Because the Black Baptist Church is a crucial institution of American life and even of American democracy, I would argue, with the role that it played in the civil rights movement and in voter registration and fighting for civil rights and the Civil Rights Act. And this is another thing we haven't talked about yet, but there's a strong claim to be made that this congregation is the first Black Baptist church. They claim it themselves. They have a historical marker that they got the state to erect outside the church, claiming to be the first Black Baptist church. And a number of church historians agree with that analysis. If by a Black church, we mean one that is both majority Black congregation and led by a Black preacher, with David George as that first preacher. So even though he fled, he leaves this remarkable legacy behind in the United States that I didn't realize when starting the project, because in his own words, he and the congregation flee. But actually, it turns out a huge portion of the congregation also remained cohesive as a congregation and last down to the present day. They're not right on the site of the plantation, but they're just up the road from where that plantation was. And it was incredible. So they invited me, to stay for the service. And then that day and the next day, I interviewed members of the community there who shared with me, stories passed down through the generations of the origins of the congregation on the plantation. It's just remarkable.
Thanks for sharing that, Greg. It's an amazing story, a lovely coincidence, and a great way to sort of round out our conversation. It's also a good segue for the time warp. This is the segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. All right, Greg, the book is about the escapes of David George, so I wanted to pick one. And the one that most lends itself to a time warp is that moment in 1783 when he boarded a British ship in Charleston Harbor with his family to sail for Nova Scotia. So, Greg, what do you think David George's life would have looked like if he and his family hadn't been able to evacuate Charleston with the British Army in 1783?
It's a fascinating question. Unfortunately, I fear that the answer would be a tragic one. And indeed, there were many refugees from slavery who didn't manage to get on one of those British ships and get out. And it was something that the American and British negotiators in the years following the peace continued to fight over, was the status of formerly enslaved people. There was a clause in the treaty that the British were not allowed to make off with American property. And there were a lot of subsequent negotiations over whether that label applied to enslaved people, with the American negotiators arguing that it did. And there was limited space on these evacuation ships taking refugees away. So I think what's likely to have happened had he not boarded one of those ships was that he would have been re-enslaved, that he and his family would have been re-enslaved. To take a less dark turn with the question, though, had he been returned to the plantation of Silver Bluff, I like to think he would have resumed his leading role in the religious community there and helped build the vibrant church that still exists on that site, that he would have been a part of that community for longer and would have maintained the escape that I feel like I saw him making at Silver Bluff on that spiritual and community plane, even while he was legally enslaved, that he would have carved a meaningful life for himself, finding refuge in family and faith the way he did for those years between about 1767 and 1777, when he lived at Silver Bluff the first time, enslaved, and laid those foundations of the Black Baptist Church in the United States.
Well, that's a hopeful note amidst a pretty bleak history for us to end on. Obviously, you've just finished a book, The Escapes of David George, but are you working on something new? Can you tell us about what historical research topic you're working on next?
I have a lot of ideas for next projects, and I can't decide which one of them grabs me the most. So I've been thinking about returning to investigating the South Sea Company further, which I wrote about in one chapter of my first book, that held the monopoly on the British slave trade into Spanish America in the first third of the 18th century. I think there's a lot more in its story, but I'm also considering a number of other topics. So I don't know exactly where I'm headed next.
Well, I look forward to whatever direction you end up heading. If people want to get in touch with you, perhaps with questions about the book, maybe a suggestion for what project you should take on next, what's the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
You can Google for the book. It's available from all the finest booksellers. But to reach out to me, you can look me up at UCSC and feel free to send me an email. And I'm also on, the various social media sites. So I can be found on Blue Sky, Facebook, the artist formerly known as Twitter, many of these places, usually with the handle at go Mally.
Well, Greg O'Malley, thank you for joining us. I've been looking forward to reading this book for a long time and getting to talk to you about it. And I'm excited for other people to get to learn more about David George.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
As I reflect back on our conversation with Greg O'Malley, I think about it in the context of the celebrations of the 250th and the legacies of 1776. David George complicates that story because for him, like many others, freedom and liberty could only come outside the new United States. To put this right at the moment, when David George was sick with smallpox in Savannah, he knew that he would have one of three outcomes. One, he might die, but if he lived, either he would be re-enslaved if Americans found him first, or he could maintain the freedom that he had sought for so long if he made it to the British lines. And of course, as Greg O'Malley told us, he did make it to those lines and was able to find a sort of freedom in Nova Scotia and then in Sierra Leone. Though, of course, even then, the story is still complicated. The second thing I want to take away from my conversation with Greg is the importance of religious faith in this story. For one thing, the narrative of David George exists because of his faith as a Baptist and his connections to white missionaries. And while David George wasn't formally a missionary, he clearly saw himself as a leader of and a servant for his community of Black loyalists, both when they were in Nova Scotia and then eventually when they were in Sierra Leone. Finally, the story that Greg tells in The Escapes of David George is a reminder for all of us of just how much there is to learn from ordinary people in the past.
Thanks for those thoughts, Joe. Now you'll find more information about Greg, his book, The Escapes of David George, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. BenFranklin'sWorld.com/441. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World and you really enjoyed this episode, please forward it to your friends and family. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, David George could only find freedom outside of the United States. Does this story change how you think about what the revolution actually delivered? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791.